Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Welcome. I'm Edwin Rutsch, founding director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and this is our second panel for our conference on how can we build a culture of empathy and compassion. And again, as in our first panel discussion, we have our core empathy curriculum team here for our conference. I'm so pleased to have us all here together. And again, today, Sherry McCreedy is going to be facilitating. So without further ado, take it away, Sherry.
Thanks, Edwin. Hello, everybody. As we have our conversation today, I think I'd just like to start. I'm curious, what is it that brings you to this panel discussion on empathy and education today? Is there something particular that comes to mind that you'd like to share with us around what's motivating you to be here today? I'm curious, who would like to start? Just go ahead.
Well, I will. When I think about empathy and education, what brings me to the conversation is I think that it can be taught, and that the lessons, I'm looking forward to the lessons to be kind of a universal outpouring, because we really need empathy in almost every area of our lives these days.
Right. So it's possible to actually teach empathy, and that there are specific ways that can be done. And so there's a lot of, it sounds like you have a lot of hope around that. Is that it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Eileen, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. I've been involved in teaching empathy in various forms for the last nearly 15 to 20 years, and it's something that I'm still grappling with, about best practices, best ways to do it, and mostly about sustainability. But what keeps me going is that it is absolutely something that can be taught, and it's something that kids just seem to connect with right away.
Okay. So also, I'm also hearing hope there too, and a real devotion to this, and maybe some curiosity about how it can be sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the presentation of empathy or teaching empathy as sustainable, or how people maybe can learn empathy in a way that there'll be a sustained practice. I'm curious if you could say a little more about that.
I think the teaching of empathy is actually pretty easy and straightforward. And there are lots of programs that do that. There are lots of different classroom practices that support empathy. I think the problem is, or the challenge is more in creating a container, a cultural container, a framework that allows the empathy to be held within the community. Because if you're teaching empathy without a container to hold it, it's going to dissipate. And so I think keeping a live, dynamic, active container, and the container, the way I'm thinking about that is a framework that the culture holds and values, and the way empathy is acted out in all different realms, not just taught, is critical. And I think, it's about keeping that container in place. That is the challenge that I've seen in the schools I work in.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. All right, I suspect we will come back to that.
Well, I'll just add
I just want to check Edwin with you. Yeah.
Well, I've just been, as I've kind of gotten into this work around empathy more and more, I've been learning from different modalities about empathy, from mediation to nonviolent communication to reading books and different practices. So I feel like I've actually learned more about empathy myself. So there's hope, if I can do it, other people can do it too. So I don't know that much about it in the schools. I didn't have it. There was nothing really taught in the schools around empathy when I was growing up, but just, for example, having studied a little bit about mediation, if I would have learned that in the schools, you know, at a young age, that would have served me in my life, for my whole life, to have had some classes on mediation, as well as doing some kind of conflict, you know, resolution and mediation in the schools. I think that would have been really handy. So I'm pretty optimistic that it can be taught. And I talked to Mary Gordon, who has the Roots of Empathy program, and she says empathy is caught, not taught. But which I think is saying that it needs to be modeled. But I would think it can be taught as well as modeled.
So something really, really important to bring into an educational context and to have there perhaps as a process that's caught and not just taught. And
yeah.
And to maybe amplify that is what I'm hearing. Yeah.
And there's hope. If I can learn it, others can learn it. So
yeah.
I'm trying to be funny. You guys didn't laugh.
Oh. Yeah, that's interesting. There's hope on all sides here.
Yeah.
I'm imagining that's something that informs all of us for being here today. So, all right. Yeah, I anticipate that I'm really curious to hear more about empathy in an educational context. And before we go there, I think though I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what your understanding of empathy is. You know, when we use that word, sometimes people mean different things when they use the word, and I'm curious for you, you know, what empathy is, and then also, you know, how does that relate in education? I'm imagining those two are connected, and then we can move to kind of specifics about bringing it in. So I'm curious if you'd like to respond to that. What is empathy? What's your understanding of empathy, and how does that relate to education? Mutima, do you want to speak to that?
The definition that I have been using around empathy is the ability to be reflective and understand another person's emotions, the circumstances that they're involved in or going through, and to have some sympathy for them, to be able to feel what they're feeling and be able to step out of oneself in order to do it.
Mm. Yeah, so
that's the definition that I'm working with.
Okay. So really, the feeling other people's feelings, having that sympathy, that kind of emotional connection to really be with them, and to know, to hear that person's circumstances too, how those are related.
Right. So yeah. It's almost like stepping out of oneself to understand why another person is responding the way that they're responding.
Mm. Stepping out of yourself. So in a way, like if one person's circumstances are different from another's, they would still be able to understand how it is for the other person.
Yes.
Yeah. Kind of transcending our circumstances in a way and seeing our common humanity. It almost sounds like, those are my words though. But
yeah.
Does that resonate for you?
Yeah, it does resonate for me. Mm-hmm. It does.
All right. How about Ilene or Edwin? Do you want to share your understanding of empathy?
I'll piggyback on that. I think my the way I hold empathy in myself is really similar to what Mutima said, and it's not only being able to walk in another person's shoes, it's being willing to take your shoes off and step into theirs. Mm. And so I think the way I think about it is it's being willing to sort of step out of yourself and into a place of curiosity, a place of unknowns, in order to really just hear and feel another person's experience without filtering it so much through your own. Mm-hmm. And I think that maybe part of the problem in education is that, or in talking about empathy, is we don't really have a shared definition of it. There's the definition that we've spoken about before that's more technical about the three parts of empathy. There's a cognitive aspect where first we're using our brains to sort of analytically process and think about another person's situation. And then there's the affective component, which is feeling the emotions in our body, both the emotions of how we're responding to the other person and how the other person's feelings might be similar or different to ours. And then there is empathic action, which is what we choose to do after we have the thoughts and feelings. So that's more technical. And then there's thinking of empathy as a value, as a cultural value, which is we value everybody's experience. And that, again, goes back to being able to step out of your own and experience or just be in the curiosity of someone else's experience, whether or not we agree, whether or not we really get it. It's being able to step out of our own filters.
Okay, so that it's interesting. I'm reminded of something that Caroline Casey has talked about how in order to be effective in the world and really work, together, we need to be able to hold more than one reality at the same time in a way, or multiple realities or multiple perspectives. And that actually that's what humor is about too, which is, Edwin, you were talking earlier about being humorous. Like, yeah, humor has to do with that surprise of multiple meanings of a word or something, or multiple perspectives. So that's one thing I'm hearing both from you, Mutima, and Eileen is about, it isn't always from one perspective or from my perspective as an example, or any particular person's perspective is part of what you're looking at as empathy. And then I'm also hearing Eileen about, the different aspects, that there's the cognitive aspect as well as the emotional aspect, and then how we bring those together and what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would add to Eileen's definition is I kind of see the empathy as a four-part empathy. And the first part would be self-empathy, is being aware of my own feelings, kind of a sense of sensory awareness, mindfulness, just awareness of what's going on in my own being. The second part is the emotional empathy or affective empathy, which you mentioned, Eileen, is that it's using through mirror neurons. We connect with others and mirror and see what's going on. So I'm seeing all of your faces, and I can kind of get a sense of the feelings that you're feeling, that's going on. That's kind of the emotional part of it. So that's the affective empathy. And then there's the cognitive, which is kind of perspective taking the perspective of others, and then which kind of is based on kind of self-awareness, being able to recognize yourself as separate from others. And then the fourth part is what you were saying is, Eileen, is the empathic action. So it's like, after feeling all of that and kind of having that awareness, what is the action that comes out of that? And maybe another component is the common humanity, is holding everyone's humanity at once, perhaps. So the four of us is being aware of all of the humanity of the four of us, and kind of holding that in one, with a wide enough awareness to be aware of all of those and value each one as being important.
So, I almost hear five there. There's the self-empathy, and then the empathy toward another, which we look at that cognitive, affective, and action components. And then there's the holding. Beyond that, there's the whole, all of it, self and other. Is that, or am I adding?
I would say, yeah, it's you could say that the emotional empathy is emotionally holding everyone's being open. It's kind of like a quality of awareness, that we're open to hold everyone's, to be open to the mirror neurons, right? It's the mirroring of everyone and feel everyone. So I would maybe put it under more under that. But you know, these definitions, they kind of come and they go. And there's a researcher, Daniel Batson, who's been studying this for like 30 years, and he's kind of like an expert on empathy out of the University of Kansas. And he came up with 8 ways that the word is actually used in society. And so they overlap with compassion, they overlap with sympathy. So it can start getting, even the academics are kind of disagreeing. But I think there's this new definition emerging, which is based on what you were saying, Eileen, the emotional, cognitive, and empathic action. I think that's kind of where the definition is moving towards.
So all different things to think about, different ways to look at it, and then sort of those 3 components seem to capture most of the others in some way, or and that we're still kind of looking at it and trying to understand it.
Yeah, it's still it's work in progress.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
But it's good to kind of be aware of the overall, you know, the overall framework.
Yeah, I think so. I think because you know, when we think about an educational context and creating conditions for empathy within an educational context, I think as we talk about that, I think keeping in mind all these different ways to consider what empathy is really important, so we know what we're looking at. So
and remembering that every program is based on its own definition of empathy. Edwin mentioned Mary Gordon and Roots of Empathy, and her definition in the program Roots of Empathy is the ability to understand someone else's feelings. So to me, that kind of speaks to the cognitive component that we talked about. And although the program addresses the other components, the definition that's used is pretty specific.
Yeah, understanding is more of a cognitive sense versus to feel someone's emotion versus understanding the emotions. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm curious hearing that, and I'm hearing Roots of Empathy as an example of a program that's specifically working on a specific practice or specific program. Well, there's specific practices within that program. I think I'm wondering if, Eileen, did you want to say more about that, or I'm curious to hear about other practices, specific practices. How do we create conditions for empathy in an educational context? And
I think that the question you're asking sort of supersedes what any one specific program does. I think maybe looking at underlying knowledge, skills, tools is useful, and then specific programs, we can look at how those fit into there. What kind of knowledge are they trying to impart? What kind of skills are they teaching? What kind of tools are they giving kids or students to use? And Roots of Empathy does that in a really particular way that seems pretty effective and different than other programs to me. So do you want to start with specifics or talk about something more general that underlies various programs?
Yeah. Well, I think in general, I'm curious in this moment maybe to hear one specific way that you're aware of that helps to create conditions for empathy in education, whether it comes from Roots of Empathy or another program or practice. What are the practices? What works?
I think, Mutima, do you want to talk? I've been talking a while.
Well, you know, I'm over here thinking that why do we need empathy? You know, what's the purpose of why does it come up that we need to teach it? So for me, it gets to like, what's the cause of the need of empathy? And so I think that in education, where children in educational settings, that we're talking about, it's like secondary education, children who are brought together in a public setting or even a private setting, they often, it's the first time they have to deal with people that are different than themselves. And so there's a need to learn to accept differences. And at the core of the need is that there's some conflict. There's something that says, oh, I don't know who you are and what you're about because I don't understand you. I've never seen you before and you're a little different than I am or weird or whatever. And then that's why empathy is needed. It comes out of we're all in the same space. Can we get along? It's kind of the antidote to bullying. It's good for classroom management of building a culture inside the classroom. So, and then it goes, if I'm thinking about it that way, then when I look at the larger society, I would say that why I'm in the conversation is because I think that it needs to be learned everywhere so that people can have space for the other people and the things that are around that are not so familiar. So empathy is addressing a core issue that we haven't talked about yet, which is it's a place to resolve and to unite. Mm-hmm. That's what I was over here thinking about.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. I think one of the reasons maybe why we're compelled to talk about empathy in an educational setting is that our schools in general, whether they're public or private, are kind of unique social structures. There aren't too many structures in our society where kids by law are compelled to be in a building, in a classroom, in a group, day in and day out. And so what Mutima said is we're bringing together kids from all different backgrounds, from all places, belief systems, and putting them in a small group and then expecting them to learn. And there are skills that could and should be taught in order to make that go smoothly. And more research is coming out between the connection of feeling safe and being able to learn. And when we look at neuroscience, if we're in stress response states, we're not being able to access the parts of our brain where learning takes place. So it's critical that if we are using institutions like schools to teach kids, that we create environments that are safe. One program I work for called Safe School Ambassadors, we open every training by sharing the statistic that every day in the United States, over 160,000 kids stay home from school because they're afraid to go to school because of what might be said to them, what might happen to them when they're there. 160,000 kids. So at my kids' school, Oakland Tech, there's like 2,500, 2,000 kids. That would be 80 schools like Oakland Tech empty every day. Not a single student there. And then that's not even counting the kids who do come to school with that knot in their stomach, like I used to do every day about what might happen when you're there. So this is a public health issue. This is a health issue. And not only that, but when we're putting kids in an environment where they're subject to rejection and disconnection and not being part of it all, that's when we get dropouts. And that's when kids start doing other things. And that's how we see that school to prison pipeline. And I think in Oakland, we see that really clearly. The dropout rates in Oakland are like really high, 35%, I think. And when we look at the particular group of kids who are in that 35%, it's disproportionate. And so it's a spectrum of what happens to people in their lives. And until we create schools where kids feel safe and can belong and can be known, this whole continuum of social issues is going to keep happening. So I think that's why schools are such a critical starting place for empathy.
Yeah, that it really it connects to everything else. It's a social issue as well as learning specifically issue, but there's a social context of schools.
Yeah.
That schools create. And Mutima, I'm heard what you were saying. I think what I was hearing is that there's this way of addressing differences, that when people go into a social environment where others are not like them or not what they're used to, that empathy is important in addressing those differences, and that it's something I'm curious to hear more about that. I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's like addressing it right up front and saying we need to actually learn the skill or develop our empathic skills so that we can know how to deal with differences, and that can actually relate to bullying. Is that was a little ways back, Mutima? I'm curious if you can say a little more about that.
Well, I was thinking that, I've been doing diversity work for about 30 years now. And my diversity work really has been about healing racial wounds. And it's about valuing diversity. So we heal our own personal wounds so that we can come to the table and sit across from somebody that's completely different and have already had enough self-reflection so that anything that would have me reject that person, I've dealt with. And that could be just the cultural pollutances that we live in, So the question becomes, why am I thinking and holding and feeling the way that I am? And that's the self-reflection part of empathy for my own self. And then and when I do that, then I'm able to then look at somebody that is really different and see them without all of the strings attached, all of the trauma maybe that's been caused to me by the perceptions, the judgments, the stereotypes that I have been taught that I'm bringing as my own. So when I do my self-reflection, I can unravel some of that. The ability and the willingness to go through the process of being able to talk about one's own self and then to be reflective about what I'm thinking about the other is a part of what being empathic or building that mirror neuron. That's from my perspective.
So an actual conscious going in and doing self-reflection about my own judgments, my own stereotypes, everything that I bring is going to and working with that is actually going to support me in being able to be more connected with others.
Yes, and for example, a basic diversity workshop would ask a person to fill in the blanks. Black people are, Black women are, Black men are, Hispanic men are, white men are. Just what comes to your mind when I say that? Finish the sentence. Black men are. And then if you allow yourself to finish the sentence naturally without censoring with the thought that comes up, you might get a real stereotype that once you challenge, when you say, do you really believe that? We'll say, well, no. Well, where did you get that? Well, I guess I got it from the news or my parents, or you begin to do some self-reflection about why we think the way we think. Mm-hmm. Why are we holding the emotion? A lot of times when in bullying situations, somebody got beat up by somebody from another ethnic group, or their parents got beat up by somebody from another ethnic group, and so they put out this fear of this hatred. Those people are bad, and it's, it's a gross generalization of that group, and then the child, it's passed down to the child. But when you sit and say to the child, well, where'd you get that? They begin to unravel the what's been given to them, and oftentimes can clear it, because there are sometimes just blatant examples of that can't be true because so and so is your friend. It could be just that easy. But that's all, in my mind, the process of becoming empathetic. And my goal on a large scale is to help society see that we have been programmed, that we live in a culture full of pollutances, and it has to do with the way that the system is set up, where we've got people that are in are a part of the underclass, and it has to do with race and class and money and stereotypes. So that the whole concept of race is a make-up one. But anywhere you go, I was having this conversation with somebody just last night that people don't think of themselves as black or white or brown. But here we're all in the United States. We're all stuck in this color phenomena instead of we're all part of the human family. And I believe that if we taught empathy, if it was part of the educational system, that we could really break down those walls that have been built that divides races, that divides people through class, that actually feeds the industrial prison complex of that whole pipeline from education. I think we could break it down by becoming more empathetic.
Is the process for breaking it down then like an inner dialogue and a dialogue with others? Is that kind of the process you're looking at?
Yeah, I think it's within the definition that was already given. The mindfulness about self, and it would start with, well, who am I? And there's a piece where there's when we can differentiate ourselves. There's a psychology term, which means that I can see myself as who I am, but break out of just the mode of I'm a daughter, I'm a wife, I'm a woman, I'm a black woman. So when I can differentiate myself from my affinity groups and see that I'm a unique person, so that I'm not claiming that all black women are like me, or all women are like me, or all people my age are the same. I differentiate myself. That's the word. Then I become self-reflective, and I can be self-empowered, because then I don't have to do all the things that those women do or those people do. So it's a self-reflection process that starts with mindfulness of who I am. And then what I usually say is that then when you can differentiate yourself, then you see that you're a unique person that just happens to be a part of those groups or those distinctions. And then when I build my own self-esteem, then when I see somebody that's different than me, then I am curious about them. I don't automatically go to, oh, I don't know them, so I have to fear them. And if an emotion of a fear or anger comes up, I can say, oh, well, where is that coming from within me? What story am I carrying? What picture am I holding to make this seem real to me? And then sometimes it's easy to untie those knots.
Yeah. Hearing you say that, I'm really struck by what I hear from what I have heard recently from adolescents, maybe 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds in a secondary school context about bullying, that their experience of that has to do, it's all based on differences.
Right.
And then they list all the kinds of differences that they're looking at. And yet they recognize it's all based on differences. And then I also think about things that I've heard from people who are in our educational system, where there's this idea that empathy somehow means we all hold hands and we get along and we don't acknowledge our differences. We don't talk about that. We don't see ourselves as unique. We're all one big kind of human family. Then we never we don't want to directly address those differences. And so I'm just curious if maybe there's a way that giving, having that message sent, that instead of bringing it out and looking at it, we're going to not talk about it, if that could be in some way feeding what we're calling bullying today, because people are trying to figure out how to address their differences without really having any kind of support in learning how to do that in an effective way. I'm curious if any of you have any thoughts about that, that connection, that's what I was hearing, and I'm curious what you guys think about that.
Well, I'm hearing something where if we see our common humanity, there's this notion, this sense of common humanity, but within that, there's some kind of a uniqueness of each person. Mm-hmm. So it's like the common humanity and the uniqueness. So what's kind of the relationship between those two? How they kind of fit together.
Yeah, it's like having both, right? Being able to see both.
Maybe the common humanity has infinite manifestations or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, the added complication of the way our school system is built is schools are large. We're bringing together all kinds of kids, like we talked about, and there seems to be this focus on conformity of what it means to be a good student, what it means to be cooperative in a classroom setting, and how we're all alike. And that feels much safer to talk about than some of these deep differences. And so I think because of the difficulty in it and the people's varying skills of being able to address differences that are deep, like racial differences and class differences and maybe differences in gender expression or sexual orientation, those things, again, we talked about this last time, they seem to be connected to different people's values, maybe religious values, maybe something that it seems like that's not a thing that we feel safe holding each other to, that everyone can be respected. A lot of states have what are called neutrality laws around teachers being able to talk about sexual orientation differences when it's brought up. They're made to be silent and not take a, quote, position, so that they're not seen as advocating that queerness is okay. And I think that is, that's spoken, that's overt, but I think we have this subtext around other subjects like race and class, that we do the same thing oftentimes. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right, Sherry. I think that our lack of being able to grapple with those subjects makes them come out in ways like bullying and violence.
Mm.
Well, I think that once you build an empathetic environment, then those conversations are easier. Mm-hmm. So, and what you said, Eileen, earlier about the sense of having a place where you're feeling safe and nurtured and cared about. And education is very interesting. I've done a lot of work in education. I was the IIUSP coach. It was an immediate intervention underscoring performance school coach, and in the elementary school in Richmond. And so the children's test scores were low. The minority children at the school's test scores were low. So the teachers had to have a coach to come in to help them look at, well, what was going on, because the belief is that every child can learn. So what are the barriers that these children are facing that helps them not be able to learn? And although in most classroom situations or in most schools, the school wants to put it on the family. And so there's all this statistic about well, kids are in school for such a long time that no matter what's going on in the family, the school has the opportunity, if they're really focused, to impact that child's life significantly. So if we could create an environment where no matter what was happening with the child, when they got into the school, they were able to feel safe. Like in this one elementary school, they had the tribes curriculum going, and in tribes, in the morning, you sit in circle and you let everybody express how they feel, and then you validate them. Empathetic listening, you validate them, and then you say, okay, well, now you're at school, and thank you for sharing, and I hope you feel better, and now let's put our learning hat on. Because they say that the place where kids learn and where they hold their emotions is the safe place. So if there is something traumatic that's happening at school or at home, then you have to have them switch that so that it's not predominant. So you take the time to welcome the child, to greet the child, to hear what's happening. How are you? What and then you say, okay, now let's shift. But that's all empathy. That's all empathy.
Mm-hmm.
It's all empathy. And in this particular school, there were some teachers that would not open their classrooms. They wanted to, first thing in the morning, go straight into the lesson. And those teachers who were refusing to implement this kind of community setting of tribes were the children they weren't focused. They had more classroom disciplines, more fights. They got kicked out of class more often because the teachers didn't make space for them.
So there's a way then that I'm hearing that doing this circle process at the beginning of the day, to have that kind of empathic listening and to have whatever could be going on that people are bringing into the environment actually cleared the air in a way for students, cleared them for learning. And that their behavior, not only were they learning more, but perhaps their behavior, well, I'm imagining it's related, that there was more, the classroom was more effective, the learning was more effective, the classroom environment was more manageable for everyone after having this circle experience in the morning?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'm curious about that because having worked in middle and high school environments myself primarily, that's been a challenge for us. Is like, well, how do you bring something that sounds great having a circle? And I'm curious if you guys have any ideas on, in terms of, I think we're talking about how do we create conditions for empathy in education. Some of that is, time and space, and kind of knowing, is it worth the time and space? If you have a 50-minute period or 45-minute period in which you're meeting with people, and this is secondary education, more like middle and high school age, is it worth taking that time to do? And I think I know what you guys might think, but I'm still curious if you could speak to that, because this is often something that comes up with in the upper level grades 7 through 12 here in the U.S.
Well, looking at thinking about what Sherry just said, there is a real neurobiological component going on. There's a reaction happening in each child's body when they're in a circle process like that. And what that is about is creating a place where the hormones that allow the neocortex to operate can come into play. So no matter how they're entering the school, whether they've, I work in schools where kids come in the morning after their dad had been arrested the night before, their mom was out all night, they went and stayed at a neighbor's house, they didn't get breakfast, so we might have a kid like that, and we might have someone who is just feeling scared about the social interaction, and they're coming in with all of this stress response going on. Putting them in a circle together, allowing them to share stories, allowing them to feel connected, calms down and turns down the volume on those stress hormones, turns up the volume on oxytocin and other serotonin, other hormones that play into relationships and critical thinking. And then it's easier to move on to learning. So I think the question is, how do you not make the time for that? Because learning seriously cannot happen if there's fear and stress response happening.
Yeah, and I think it's really true that the children in this time are dealing with a lot of social issues that they're bringing to school. But I think it's the school's responsibility to teach them how to cope with it and to give them a space to cope with it, and to teach them how not to be how to be able to shift the mindset so they can learn. I think that the dropout rate, which is just so huge that it's kind of overwhelming to look at the public education statistic. It's really sad about how many kids are. It's really not serving. It's really not serving. But I've done teacher training for a really long time, and I have teachers who say, "I'm not here to be a social worker. I'm not even here to be a role model. I'm just here to teach the subject." And I've been saying, well, until you realize that you are a role model and your unwillingness to see that your disdain or that you're thinking that the child can't learn is affecting the child, that the low level of expectations based upon the whole view of a whole race is really impeding the child that's right in front of you. And so I think that empathy helps even with teachers' attitudes around children.
Is that empathy for the teacher, are you saying?
No, empathy, teaching the teacher to be empathetic.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Is a very valuable thing.
Yeah.
It's critical. And I'll show you a little bit why. Will you guys follow along with me? Do this with your hands. Make a circle with your forefinger and your thumb. And now put it on your chin. I can't see you guys, so I don't know where you put it. Did you put it on your chin or did you follow me?
I put it
I followed you. But I followed you.
I started on the cheek and then I changed. I said, "Oh, this is a trick."
It's a little visual example of that thing, do as I say, not as I do. It's confusing. And if we're having teachers trying to teach empathy or expect empathy as a behavior from kids and they're not willing to model it.
Yeah.
But then there's also the fact, the situation where teachers are all under stress and they're kind of needing empathy as well. They're needing to be heard, and they're needing that same connection kind of and grounding.
Circle time teachers before the school day begins. I would be there.
It's true. And that's why I'm talking about it is critical to have a container. You can't just implement a classroom. You can, but implementing just a classroom program to teach kids about empathy is not going to be effective, and therefore it's not going to be sustainable. This is, it's a framework. Say we have at the center, we want to build a community that values empathy. That's at the center. Connected to the center are all these different components. So a classroom curriculum like Tribes or Responsive Classrooms or any of these other programs we've talked about will be one part of that component. Another classroom approach is like Tribes also recommends cooperative work and cooperative seating. So kids are learning how to work together hands-on. But beyond that, the way we assess kids, the other kinds of curriculum we teach and what's focused on, how we train staff and the opportunities that we give staff to process and learn and receive empathy, how discipline is done, how parents are involved in the school, all of those things are components that plug in to create the container. So any of those without the other are going to be less effective.
Yeah, I think you're right. They'll be less effective. I've been in situations where the tribe circle in the morning is for the teacher, about the teacher. So I actually had to say to a teacher, you want to get control of your class. This is your first year. You want, to be able to be at the job next year, because, sending 5 kids out every day, you've got the lowest test scores in the whole school, and it's because you're not relating to the children. So the tribes was for her job security, to slow down and trust that it's going to be important to meet your children where they are, and to clear your stereotypical thinking about what they can and cannot learn, and give them a chance to learn. So yeah, ideally, it's great to have the whole container. But if you, in my mind, if one child learns to listen and hear the needs of another child while they're acting out, like my girlfriend, Rachel Kessler, who did the mystery schools in Denver, Colorado. She's passed, but her work's still alive. They do the mystery schools, and it's a program that they have gotten to be brought into junior highs and high schools, and they start with the kids and asking them what, they say nurturing the inner lives of students and teachers. So what are your mystery questions? And just to deal with, oh, well, is there really a God, or why does this happen, and what's going to happen to me? All those mystery questions are part of building a safe environment, thinking about the child's inner life and the inner life of the teacher. In that setting, we would have teachers who actually save children's lives, because in one instance, the mystery question was all about, well, what happens when I die, and is it wrong to kill myself? So I'm an advocate for the whole picture shifting, but in the meantime, one person at a time, one child at a time,
Exactly.
one exercise at a time,
and maybe one teacher at a time too. In the sense of the support that I hear teachers, that I think teachers also need, and the empathy. So like the idea that there was hearing that there was a circle for a teacher. I hear that as support for the teacher to look at, to get the support that she needed so that things could work in her classroom, which is what she wanted and what her students would want, right?
Yeah, and this ability to want to change, but that this is going back to the definition of empathy, which is, in my mind, the most important part of the definition is the empathetic action. So yeah, you see me, you appreciate me, I'm different, you're willing not to throw darts at me or to shoot me or to dismiss me. So that's part of your action. That could be part of your action. And then there's something else that needs to happen on a more collective level. That is my goal around wanting to push building a culture of empathy. It's because we, in my mind, is that there's this unconscious place where all of us, even myself included, is a part of the creation of what we have. And part of it is so messy, and the other part is so beautiful. So I'm now I'm willing to look at the messiness and say, how do I begin to unravel it? And part of unraveling it is really about being willing to address it and to look at it and to face it, to say, this isn't the pipeline thing, this whole Jim Crow. I don't know if you guys have heard of Michelle Alexander. She's written a book called The New Jim Crow. And so she's talking about the effects of the Jim Crow laws, which was right after slavery, and how the prison industrial complex is really a direct result of it. That, we're not enslaving people the way that we used to. We've got this other system where you do a minor crime, you get a felon. So, but my point is that we're all in this together. We've created all of this together. And to be able to say, oh my goodness, if I really knew as a teacher that my pension fund was investing in prisons, I would be furious.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of hope that I have about empathetic, the action part. And then to be able to say, well, I'm going to diverse, what's that word? My investments, because I'm not in agreement with that. But what has happened is that we're on automatic so much that we just think that what we're thinking is correct. We don't take the time to really even look into each other's eyes so that we can actually have that mirror neuron be triggered and say, oh yeah, I really understand what you're coming from, where you're coming from, and I'm willing to do this to help correct that. That's, in my mind, the most important piece of the whole empathy process.
Yeah. So coming back to that self-reflection and awareness and willingness to engage.
Yes.
Well, one thing, we're coming up to almost an hour. And I was wondering if you could, if there was some questions we had for future discussions, what questions would you ask or what would you want to explore around nurturing and fostering and teaching empathy in the education system? I'm kind of taking over the moderation, Sherry. I don't know if that was, is that something we could I'm just curious what.
Yeah. Well, I had one earlier. I'm trying to remember what it was. I was thinking we're getting ready to close, and I was going to ask if there's anything else anyone wanted to offer to the conversation, and was going to start with you, Edwin. So
that was what I would be wondering, is like, what are questions like? This feels really juicy, like we really kind of, touching on a very, interesting, important topic. And it's like, how would we go forward with other questions to explore that are maybe more detailed and so.
Well, what comes up for me is that maybe there is a way that there could be an empathy tip at a school, and teachers come get empathy first and see if it made a difference. Or to remind teachers that taking the time to really build a classroom environment, to invite them into an experiment of just slow it down enough to build a safe container and see how much more your children will learn. I think that this push for testing and for results has really, even the No Child Left Behind has pushed so many kids out because it was all about getting them ready to pass the test and not about really where they are. So I think that I know that Eileen, one of the projects that you're doing in the schools that's helping kids learn by watching a baby. I think I'm very fascinated about that work. So maybe you want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think using it in Roots of Empathy, the teacher is actually a baby, and I'm the instructor, and I'm there to facilitate. But the person who's teaching us about feelings and then giving us sort of a jumping point to look at how those concepts relate to ourselves is the baby. And I think the brilliant thing about that is babies are they don't have all the filters built in. They don't look at the kids and judge them the way that older kids or adults might do. So it's this relationship of total acceptance. And the baby gets so excited to see the kids, and the kids get so excited to see the baby. And it's just based on like that pure goodness. There's nothing underlying it. There's no, hidden motivations about positioning or anything. So it allows the kids to access, I think, a really pure kind of experience of empathy in the way most other programs don't. And that's what stands out to me about it. But one thing I want to say is with my work in Oakland schools over the last decade, it seems like what it comes down to, regardless of the program or how great it is, whether it's Tribes Mutima, which Oakland schools used to sponsor and train teachers in, and I think is an awesome program, and any other number of programs, it comes down to time. Mm-hmm. And teachers don't have the time during the day to implement these things because of all the other things, test scores and the literacy program Oakland uses, which pretty much sets the schedule for the entire day. And offering teachers empathy groups is something that we've done a lot, but it's hard because it's, then again, is time, and they're not paid for that time it would take. So it's another... Is our call okay?
Yeah, Mutima dropped off, but we can continue.
Okay. It even though people understand the value of it cognitively, it's yet another thing to fit in. So until leadership really makes empathy or this kind of social emotional learning a priority equal to other priorities like literacy and math, it's really hard to do. But the desire's there.
Yeah.
So,
Edwin, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here. We're okay.
Okay, speaking of time, I think it is time for us to close. And I think there are more questions to be asked and more things to talk about for sure. I could see us doing spending some time on what are, kind of efficient ways to address this, small ways that we can bring empathy into educational environment that are to acknowledge that issue of time, because I think it is a big one as well. So on that note, is there anything else anyone wants to add before we close for today?
Thank you, Sherry, for moderating, and everyone for taking part. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I think it's a very fruitful topic.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Sherry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mutima and Eileen and Edwin. Yes.
Okay, thanks.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.